My name is Paul Mason. I'm the Director of Responsive Programs at Innovate UK, and I'm the host for this session on responsible innovation. I'd like, first of all, to thank my co-panelists, whom I'll introduce later, to BSI for their excellent work on this programme, and also to BSI and Lemon Zest for doing the conference today. And to thank you all for coming, of course. This is the plan for the session. We've got 40 minutes or so. I'm going to just explain who Innovate UK are, my organisation, in case you don't know. Many people will, of course. And then we'll talk a little bit about what responsible innovation is, and then about this particular standard PAS 440. We'll then cut to a panel discussion with the two panelists and have a bit of a Q&A with questions from the floor. You don't need to wait until we're into the panel session to raise Q&A. So if there's anything that occurs to you as we go through the session, please do pop it in there. And Elaine Shine from BSI will sort of try and convene the questions and find common themes and put interesting questions to us so we can discuss them at the panel. And then I'll wrap up with a couple of concluding remarks, and we should finish at about 11:25. So that is the batting order. So a couple of slides just on Innovate UK. If you don't know who we are the UK's innovation agency. We're a part of UK Research and Innovation. We define innovation as being the commercially successful exploitation of new ideas. So effectively, we are here to help companies develop new products and services and to grow the economy on the basis of that. And we invest in technologies in any technology area and companies of any size operating in any market. And innovation is really important for a number of reasons, not least of all, of course, productivity. It accounts for half of productivity growth, which underpins the improvement in our standard of living. But actually getting new things forward can improve society and improve the quality of life. So that's what we're for. We know that what we do works. As I speak to you today, we're supporting something like 2,800 companies. Over the course of our history, we're about 12 years old, we've supported 8,500 companies. And those companies have created around 100,000 jobs. So it is impact at scale in the UK economy, and we're quite proud of that achievement so far. Of course, there's plenty more to do, not least of all as we think about recovery from the current position and survival in the nearer term for more fragile organisations. So a little bit about responsible innovation then. What is it? Well, it's defined in the PAS. There's the definition there. It is the careful consideration of and actions to address the potential impacts of introducing a new product, service, process or business model. And that impacting could be on the innovating company, and most companies would be aware of that, or it could be impacting their supply base or their customers, or for their investors, or in wider society and the environment. And the basic idea is that business and society are better when you achieve the upside benefits of innovation, but avoid any potential downside. And we'll say more about that in a moment. If I can just get my next slide. Okay. Good. So the question then is, well, what is responsibility? What do we mean? And I think it boils down to what society accepts. And at the moment in the UK, that's governed by the democratic process. I don't mean at the moment. I think that's how it is in democracies. So we elect representatives. They pass laws. They're intended to protect us and to ensure good behaviour. And then there is enforcement of those laws through the courts and the police and through regulators in some areas. And this works very well for understood and established technologies, or where there's infrastructure exists. So the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, for example, have done some extremely good work at the cutting edge of emerging technologies as to what should or should not be lawful. A nice example is the mitochondrial disease therapy that was passed in 2015. But not all very early stage technologies have such a regulatory body in place to help society decide what should or should not happen. And that process does take time. It was 5 years between the first request to look at mitochondrial therapy and the passing of the law that made it lawful. So 5 years is quite a long time in technology development. And what we want to do is not slow down that so that society can benefit. And that's what the purpose of this Responsible Innovation PAS is all about. How do you, in the absence of a clear framework about what should be done, how do you make sure that you're doing the right thing? So in respect of that, if you're an academic, that you can draw on the University Ethics Committee. All universities in the UK have an ethics committee, and if you're doing some work that raises questions of an ethical nature, you need to get permission from the ethics committee, and they will allow you or not allow you to do that piece of research work. And that system works very well. We don't want to interfere with that. But if you're a company, there is no single place that you can go to that gives you a structure for how to think about the problem. I should say that the standard doesn't tell you the answer, it tells you how to think about the problem, and it gives you some way of doing that in a systematic way and documenting it and proving that that's what you've done and explaining your thinking. But the thinking and the decision making rests with the company, not defined by us in the standard. So my experience after sort of 35 years in industry is that most companies want to do the right thing, but it isn't always clear what the right thing is. And what is also not always done by companies is to try and identify misuse or unintended consequences, or things that can propagate further down supply chains, not intended by them, but that might actually happen in society. And one of the things that the PAS will hopefully do is to address that. So I'm really, really proud today to be launching this standard, PAS 440. It's the result of considerable amount of work and something like 6 or 8 years worth of work within Innovate UK. It's been brilliantly drafted by Joyce Tate, who unfortunately can't be with us today because she's unwell. So I would say to Joyce, gute Besserung, get well soon, and thank you for all your hard work. And it's been overseen by a steering group which have added real value, and it's the result of public consultation. So the considerable effort through the standards process overseen by BSI, and that was, I think, very successful. It's a great document. So I'll tell you a little bit about what's in the document, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it because you can download it for free and read it at your leisure. But effectively, it's intended to help companies innovate more responsibly and to help them to move forward quickly and properly. So it isn't intended to put the brakes on innovation. It is intended to improve the quality of innovation from the perspective of wider society. And there are lots of potential benefits from doing that. You should end up with new products and services that you don't then have to explain or withdraw. It should save you cost and improve the sustainability of what you do. It'll improve trust in the company, which can make you a more attractive employer. It improves your brand value, and it can be quite important for raising investment from anything from angel upwards. And perhaps we can say more about that later. So it's a good thing to do. And the basic principle of the PAS is that it recognizes that technology per se is neither good nor bad. What matters is what people do with it. So I wouldn't want to live in a house without electricity, but neither do I want it in my bath. So electricity is both a fantastic thing and an incredibly dangerous thing. And it's the control of good technologies and powerful technologies that really matters. And what the PAS guidelines should help companies to do is to achieve the benefits of what they're intending to do, but help them to avoid or mitigate or put in place preventive measures around any potential harms or unintended misuse. And it also gives them a framework for communicating that to broader society, which can be very valuable for the reasons that I mentioned on the previous slide. So here's a little bit of information about the structure. It has some definitions and it talks about the principles. It has a section 5 on how to use it. And then there are 2 basic structures to it. So the first thing, section 6, is about how everything in a company gets done. So that's company-wide innovation. And then sections 7 and 8 are all about an innovation specific for a particular innovation. So you can come at this from either way. As a company, you could decide you want for everything you do to come within the framework of responsible innovation, or you could decide that that's too big a step. And if you're a small SME startup, you might well decide that. And actually what you want to do is to take the particular product idea that you've got and make sure that you innovate responsibly for that. And that could lead into organizational wide responsibility, but it need not. But at least it means the thing that you're doing, which is at the margins where you haven't asked yourself those questions, you now have a way of taking those things into account. And then it speaks quite a bit to stakeholder engagement, which is an important component of this activity for reasons that will hopefully come out in the panel discussion later. The last thing is about reporting, and that is an important part of transparency, is the ability to explain your thinking. Not everybody might agree, but at least when you're transparent in your thinking, then I think you're trying to do the right thing. So within the company level responsibility clause 6, there is already a corporate social responsibility standard, ISO 26000, and it covers those basic points there. I won't run through them because you can download the slides and look at them at your leisure later. But in addition to that, we refer to some more specific points, and it has a template, particularly table 1 in the standard, for helping you to get started. And I think the idea here is it will be slightly lighter touch. ISO 26000 is really good, but it's quite long, and so that's fine if you're a major corporate, but if you're an SME, it could be considered slightly difficult to do. So we've created this light touch table that would allow you to at least start the process of thinking about how everything that you do, all of your operations, might start to move in the direction of demonstrating total responsibility. The bit that this PAS is really seeking to address is about specifically disruptive technologies, or it's particularly relevant for disruptive technologies. And that's very important because sometimes in the case of a disruptive technology, it's not yet clear what the technology can do. It isn't yet clear what the potential downsides are. There may have been no cases of misuse or potential harm. We've got to try to prevent them. We've got to try and stop them from happening. Sometimes society may not yet have formed a view. There may be no legal framework, and there are a number of cases where that is the case. Or the regulatory position is still emerging. What we don't want is to have bad things happen in new market areas, for the regulator to clamp down on them really quickly, and then for us to, as a society, throw the baby out with the bathwater, or to put forward unhelpful regulations from an economic or a societal point of view, but made with the best of intentions. So that section speaks to identify the potential harms, what could go wrong, how do I avoid them. There's a table here that speaks to that. Again, I won't go into a great deal of detail, but it asks people to think about the good things that come in a number of different elements to do with, for example, the societal impact, or to do with the environmental impact, or to do with the health impact or impact in the value chain. And then it asks you to draw out whether they're positive impacts in one row, or whether they might be risks in another row. And then it starts to ask you, what's your plan for that risk, or what's your plan for achieving that benefit? And then this document is intended to be living. So it's not something you do once and put in a drawer. It's something that should be a living document that should continue as we move forward. So I think that's all I want to say about the PAS at this moment. I would commend it to you. I'll make a few comments at the end to draw it together about what might happen next. And in the meantime, I'd like to introduce my expert panel, whom I hope you can all see on the screen. It's Dave Hughes and Rory Yates. Both of them were on the advisory board to oversee the creation of the standard. And both of them have considerable expertise on the topic. So I think you'll find them to be good interlocutors. Dave works for Syngenta. He's a synthetic organic chemist and came back to the UK after postdocing in the US to join what was then Zeneca, which became part of Syngenta in due course. And he spent several years, I'm not going to say how many because it would be impolite, but he spent a long time, a good career, investigating how pesticides can work, designing them and introducing them to market, and then also more recently moved into a role where he's responsible for sourcing new technologies and building relationships with universities and with other partners around the world, all of which in the broad scope of agriculture and how do you use those technologies for agriculture, and then how do they get made available at scale through the good auspices of Syngenta. He also faces a number of other public sector, public good bodies. So he's on the Global Food Security Strategic Advisory Board. He sits on the Transforming Food Production Advisory Board, and he's provided evidence to things like UK government select committees and sitting on public sector strategy reviews. So as well as trying to drive forward the business within Syngenta, he's playing his part within the wider UK society in how those technologies can be developed and adopted. So that's Dave. Dave, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
So that's a very physical business. Rory Yates is the leader for digital solutions for a company called DXC. So we've got a digital business and a physical products business. And Rory has overarching responsibility for digital solutions within HSC. And that is all about how you use digital technologies to achieve breakthrough transformation, so improve product or offerings across a wide range of verticals. So he's done work in financial services and insurance, in sport, in logistics, in engineering, in retail, in life sciences. So a huge range of different verticals who are taking digital technologies and trying to work out what they do to enhance their business and offer better value to their customers. And specific names of companies he's worked with include the Football Association, Barclays, Cantor Media, WPP, the Sir Martin Sorrell Advertising Group, and Santander, the bank. He's a winner, or with his clients, joint winners of a number of awards. The Campaign magazine Top Digital Innovation Award in 2015. Last year, in 2019, the Daddy Awards for Digital Innovation for a wonderful project with getting girls to play football in conjunction with the Football Association and the Met Police. That's a really nice piece of work that was recognised in those awards. And he's also a mentor for Techstars back in 2013. So he's got a wealth of expertise, including how you use digital technologies in a responsible way. So panel members, thank you very much for giving up your time this morning and for joining us. I'd like to sort of pose 3 or 4 questions to you initially before we throw the discussion out for questions from the floor. Maybe we could start with just a bit of an overview from what each of you are doing currently within your own organizations in the area of responsible innovation. And perhaps, Dave, would you like to start with what you're doing on responsible innovation within Syngenta?
Sure. Okay. So I think the key thing to understand here is that the technology-based underpinning farming, food production, and agriculture at the moment is diversifying rapidly. So you mentioned disruptive potential. There is huge disruptive potential in agriculture right now. So for example, we're working on completely new ways of optimizing the DNA sequence of crop seeds. We're looking at completely new ways of controlling pests and completely new ways of helping crops survive environmental stresses like heat and drought. Then there's digital technologies like robotics and artificial intelligence and the impact that they can make on farming, not only on farming, in fact, but also on the processes that we use in-house to help us invent new products as well. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on. Plus, of course, food is always controversial. Everyone needs food every day. Everyone's got an opinion on food. And there's nothing like a global crisis like what we're facing at the moment to help you appreciate things you typically take for granted and perhaps help you realize that the critical supply chains that we rely upon are perhaps not as robust and resilient as we might like. And there are also a huge number of stakeholders in the field, often with different and irreconcilable views. So on the one hand, you have, for example, large, powerful groups whose marketing position is based on nostalgia and traditionalism, who instinctively are very suspicious about anything new. Whilst on the other hand, at the other extreme, there's a huge froth of SMEs and startups who want to change absolutely everything about the food that we eat and how it's produced. You know, things like cell-grown meat, for example, and ultra-high density vertical farming systems relying on hydroponics and aquaponics with not a grain of soil in sight. So to summarize, I think it's all kicking off in food and agriculture at the moment. It's a really exciting time to be part of agricultural innovation, but the need to do things in the right way has never been more important. And this is where I hope this pass can add significant value.
That's a really good overview of a large and complex system. And as somebody who's been trying to buy a tin of tomatoes for about 3 weeks and failed to buy one until yesterday for the first time, I could identify with your point about the food supply chain. Thanks for that, Dave. Rory, what about you? What are you doing within DXC?
Well, I think Dave's just covered a lot actually related to his industry. I mean, it's the same in lots of others. So working with pharmaceutical businesses, the NHS at the moment, you know, trying to innovate fast to solve some of their problems. Absolutely, at the moment, it's never become more important to act responsibly and in the right way. And I think actually what we're going through with COVID-19 has shone a massive light of consciousness across all of our clients and accelerated those conversations. But more broadly, we've been working on innovation, managed innovation capabilities across a range of clients for some time. And through this, the development of this PAS, I've been engaging with a number of clients in the pharma industry in particular who are keen because it's clear that their agenda is to act more responsibly or continue to act more responsibly despite wanting to deliver more innovations to market quicker. So we've been working closely with them on that basis anyway, and this PAS gives us the opportunity to formalise that and to provide them even more structure and guidance than we have been to date. That's really the focus for us at the moment.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think as a consultancy, you're in a very powerful position to reach into lots of different types of organisations and help them to do the right thing. So we're making the assertion really in this PAS that it matters, that it's important, that why wouldn't you just carry on and do things as the best way you would think possible, but without needing to put a formal structure around it. So it might be interesting just to start with to carry on this conversation with a kind of, what's the downside? What can go wrong if organizations don't follow this process very comfortably? And perhaps you could each give me or give the panel, the audience, some examples of what has gone wrong in the past, what the impact of it has been, and therefore, why is it that we're so positive about the idea of this standard? I don't know which of you might like to start.
I can go. I think within agriculture, we have the textbook example of how it can go really very badly wrong, and that's with genetically modified crops. So I need to be a little bit careful what I say here in public, but I think it's safe to say that there were miscalculations made about the introduction of GM technologies in Europe, and the upshot was a public backlash against the technology. That means that GM crops are still not available for farmers and consumers in Europe even to this day, even though they've been used for 25 years on a global scale, and there's now a mountain of evidence supporting both the safety and the benefits that surround this technology. It's not a scientific issue anymore. That's now beyond doubt. It's entirely a political issue, and there's no sign of that changing anytime soon. What I would say, though, a point that's not often made about GM, in my view, the regulatory environment has crushed the innovation potential of this technology, even in parts of the world where the regulatory system is functional, like in the United States. The key issue from my point of view is that the degree of regulation means it's incredibly expensive to get a new GM crop onto the market, $100 million or more. But the problem is that the seeds that are produced are still relatively cheap commodities, which means that this $100 million upfront fee that needs to be paid, that generally collapses the business case for almost all applications of this technology. So technically, it's actually quite straightforward to think of ways of making food hyper nutritious or hyper delicious. But the business cases for doing that never stand up to scrutiny. So it only actually works for the very largest commodity crops like corn and soybeans, and the most valuable traits like herbicide tolerance and insect resistance. Loads of other things would be possible, but even in parts of the world where GM is accepted, the regulatory environment has collapsed the business case. And that, I think, is a real shame. And
that's a really, I think, important point, because the principle is generalizable to any potential technology. Any technology which receives a public backlash or is not accepted by society does risk getting stopped in its tracks, and then it just doesn't happen at all, or it's very difficult to do in new innovation. Rory, there might be some examples in the digital domain.
Yes, yeah, and we've talked, haven't we, about Cambridge Analytica, and everybody's had that discussion, I'm sure. And I'd like to talk to a near miss case. So in applying automation or AI, it's all too easy to write the business case to erode the workforce and save money essentially and go through that cost saving exercise. But we work with a global marketing function of a large organisation that I can't name. And essentially, the challenge was to remove a lot of their workforce were working on data-driven tasks, when actually the marketing job was obviously to derive marketing campaigns and marketing value and engage customers and so on. So we used automation, but all too quickly, people started to write the business case of less marketing people are therefore needed because we're removing all of these tasks out of the organisation. And we set about working with them to actually address the fact that their marketing job descriptions weren't about data tasks. They were about creating marketing campaigns and generating more value for that business. And we centered the whole approach around freeing human capital and being able to return people back to their jobs, their marketing jobs, and optimizing those, and actually generate net increased value for the business through that marketing effectiveness. So yes, we did automate all the data tasks out of their function, or a vast majority of them, and got them focused on insight. And I think that's the key. So the same with Cambridge Analytica. Actually the machine can do an awful lot of good, but it can do an awful lot of bad, and we have to take responsibility for that. And everybody involved has to take responsibility, whether you're commissioning that machine to do that task or whether you're developing the machine to do that. You have to take a responsibility. And as I say, with negative business cases, they're all too easy to write, but they do not necessarily create the best value for humanity.
So the guidance for AI technology is it's not about reducing headcount, it's about creating more value in your organization.
Absolutely, and it is lazy, frankly, but irresponsible not to put that. Like I say, free human capital is one of the key messages that we tend to focus on when we're addressing this topic.
We were talking earlier about AI. I mean, that's a technology. Well, it's a series of technologies that are far-reaching potential. I mean, and I think many people would say we're only at the beginning of the ways in which that technology can be used. But already we're starting to see some adverse effects from that technology. The case of recruitment bias against women or ethnic minorities in some cases being systematized, which was very embarrassing for a couple of companies. The black woman in the United States who was arrested on grounds of mistaken identity because the machine learning algorithms that were being deployed were less effective if you happen to have black skin. And the whole issue about balancing privacy versus location awareness for proximity testing, for are you within 2 meters of somebody else based on where your phone is, that kind of technology. So there are lots of issues that some of these digital technologies arise. The newspapers are full of them, and yet as a society we will benefit enormously if we can deploy them in a proper way.
Absolutely. Just to expand on that, I mean, that's a very good point, right? Machines are only as good as the data, and we're biased as humans. But what we don't want to do is encourage or exaggerate or even install those biases in even further parts of society. So you just have to take, as you say, absolute responsibility for what you're doing, and not just on the automation value, but the actual, the net value that you're trying to create for everybody.
So, thank you. So I think one thing that might be worth talking about then is this thing about unknown unknowns, because I mean, on the grounds that most people who are innovating are trying to do the right thing, and let's assume that they've tried to think about what could go wrong and haven't been able to find very much, or they think they've got it under control if they did find something. How do you find out about the things that you don't know about, the things you ought to be controlling or mitigating against, that are just on your radar because you haven't read about them, or you haven't nobody's taught, your customers haven't mentioned it to you? How do you go about that? Any thoughts, panel?
Yes. Well, I think if you have true unknown unknowns, which are unforeseeable by definition, they're always going to be tricky to deal with in any kind of innovation framework. There's always the possibility that unforeseen hazards may emerge after a new technology has been launched. That's an intrinsic risk, okay? So you can do things like post-launch monitoring of new technologies to make sure that you can identify such unforeseen hazards as quickly as possible, and hence put mitigation measures in place. I think this talks to a wider issue, though. I think society needs to appreciate that all innovation has some associated risk. The innovators can work to minimize risk as much as possible, but you can't eliminate risk altogether, even though there seems to be this feeling in society that absolute levels of safety are required for anything new to be introduced. Zero tolerance for risk, absolute certainty. But you've got to think, though, if you'd applied those standards in the past, you wouldn't have things like vaccines or blood transfusions or organ transplants or IVF babies or anything like that, So if you're going to actually seriously, rigorously implement zero tolerance for risk, that essentially anchors our society in the present, which discounts any potential future benefits from innovation. So I would suggest that history would tell us that's not a sensible position to take because of the impact that innovation has had on the quantity and quality of life that has been generated over the past 100, 200 years or so.
That's a really important point, and I hope the PAS speaks to that, in that what it seeks to do is to find a balancing between the good things that come from something that you could do against the potential downsides that can come from something. And you have to draw, I don't think there's necessarily a right answer in that, but the question is what is done in response to the thinking does it seem reasonable to a broad section of stakeholders who might care? And that may be as best as we can manage. Rory,
that's right, Paul, because we've put that in there. You've got to be clear about how you're managing the risk, not that you need to completely remove it. Or being aware and conscious is the most important thing with some of these risks. Some of them you shouldn't take, absolutely. Loss of life and so on. These aren't acceptable, but others, as David's saying, absolutely, we need to be able to live with them. If we can manage them and we can cope with them, and the value outweighs the risk, then you should proceed. I think I think one of the other problems is in innovation is successful innovation absolutely acts on the most insight, right? So the more insight you have into the human context, the technology trends, and the business drivers behind what you're doing, the more insight you have into that, the better. Even better, though, is to act on foresight. So this PAS does encourage that exploration, and that's what I particularly like about it, is that you are made to be more conscious. You're asked to consider these things, and foresight isn't as difficult as people like to think. I mean, we've been living with the new technologies that are driving the world today, blockchain, AI, long enough. They've been implemented enough that actually, if you go looking for information evidence of other people having done it first, innovation absolutely isn't about originality. To quote Steve Jobs, we're reusing an awful lot, and so there's an awful lot already to learn. The world's moving fast enough for that to be the case. If you are inventing, I think pure invention, which is distinguishable from innovation in a lot of ways, it's the same process, though. You still need to just operate with a huge amount of insight and as much foresight as you possibly can. But certainly in technologies, we've got enough view of technology trends that we can look at least 2 or 3 years out and be fairly certain of what the impact might be.
Those are excellent points. And in the PAS, there are links to documents which you can read and think about, which might shed light on the questions you're asking yourselves. And then, of course, there's a whole section on stakeholder engagement, and that allows you to broaden the conversation you're having and get wider inputs from different people. I think we should probably, Elaine, I don't know, I mean, I've got lots of questions because this is a super panel and there are loads of things I'd like to get their views on. But we did promise the audience an opportunity to raise some questions and things.
Can I add one more point, Paul? Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, it's just because on that basis as well, you've just mentioned it and it triggers the point. I think everything I've done for the past 23 years really has been done through a user-centered design process. So the more engaged, when you say stakeholders, that is to involve all of the stakeholders. When we're in regulated environments, I see too often, an early innovation process, and it kills innovation. It stalls it, it delays it. You haven't involved your regulatory authorities. You haven't done the necessary feasibility, viability reviews. Desirability is cheap. Ideas are cheap. It's actually turning them into reality that's a little bit more difficult. And the more you bring that stuff up front, and the more you are user-centered, so the more you involve real consumers and real people, the better. And you mentioned the Football Association. We deliberately worked with the Met Police and had to go through some quite horrific analysis of what goes on online when it's to do with children and how vulnerable they are. But you have to do it, because if you're going to do something that encourages girls to play football, but you're going to do it through digital technologies, you better be damn sure you're protecting them and applying the right safety.
Extremely good points, all of them. Sorry, Elaine, anything?
Yeah. So we've 2 questions on hidden bias. So does the PAS deal with accountability for unexpected and possibly inexplicable bias in either training data for machine learning or actual working in algorithms for neural networks?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, we slightly touched on that before, Rory, but would you like to unpack that a little bit about how you do ensure bias or training, and then this particular thing about computer says no or computer says yes, how can you understand what it is that is driving the algorithms, and I guess accountability. So I mean, is it the coder, is it the user, is it how do you unpack that from a responsibility point of view?
I think the whoever raised that's absolutely right. It's all down to the data, and we can absolutely train and understand subconscious biases and data, and we can absolutely extract those biases out and either do that at the data level or do it in the way that you're allowing the machine to operate. We're not quite at the stage where things aren't programmatic. When we get to fully cognitive AI solutions, we're going to have to be even more conscious about how we ensure the machine doesn't develop its own biases, corrupt the data, make decisions that aren't in the favour of humanity. And that area needs further exploration. It's a good example of what Dave was talking about. We're going to have to move with managed risk on a lot of those areas. But for now, where you're creating chatbots based on programmatic principles, you absolutely need to train the machine to operate in the right way, and reconfigure your data so that you remove as much bias as you possibly can from that.
So start with the data, worry about the algorithm second.
That's how we're doing it. Yeah.
Good idea. Elaine, another one?
Yeah, another question has come in for looking at the difference between how this PAS looks at innovation and research. So all the statements have been focusing on the innovations from companies, but does the PAS touch on research arms of government? And you've already made the distinction between research and innovation, but maybe we touch on that point.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I should speak to that, because we've sort of 8 years of chewing on that particular bone. I mean, it's a very well made point. And this started life as a responsible research and innovation standard. And then we made the decision that, several things really. I mean, of course, it matters how you conduct research, and the university ethics committees are incredibly important. But for society as a whole, it's really when things are in a watercourse near you, or in the air that you're breathing, or in the food on your plate, or on your computer that when you're browsing the web or something. That's when it hits 62 million people living in the UK, or potentially however many 5 billion people or so who are connected in globally. I don't know the exact number up to date. And so we kind of felt that the absence of guidance was harshest for companies, and that's why we decided to move away from responsible research and innovation into responsible innovation, because that was where there was just nothing really for companies to go to. You want to do the right thing, you want to have a structured framework. If you're managing quality, you can go to ISO 9000 and you get a good set, no matter what your business is about, you get some sensible guidance. And the same for ISO 14000 or ISO 18000 for health and safety or environmental issues. If you're trying to do responsible innovation, there's nowhere to go. If you're a researcher, then your ethics committees are very strong. If you're in a public sector research laboratory or something, or you're part of the government chief scientific advisors or the CSAs within the government departments, then I think you're not quite in the university ethics committee space, and you're not quite a company. So there is a little bit of a void there. I would encourage people in that area to try to do the right thing. There's no reason they couldn't use this PAS and see how adaptable it is for them to try it. It might have exactly the sort of things that they care about. Most government departments have good relationships, at least that I'm aware of, with academia in a number of different ways. I mean, they commission research projects from them and things. They might be able to find a tame university ethics committee to form a view on something they were proposing to do and get some outside input. I'd be surprised if that wasn't doable somehow or other. So I would definitely think that they should try and behave responsibly. But we had to focus this PAS on something for it to have any chance of becoming specific enough to be useful to a key audience. And there are, let's remember, there are 4.5 million businesses in the UK and 140 universities, and so we were very much focusing on the statistics of the businesses.
Yeah, I think we've 3 minutes left now in the session. So there's one question on how the PAS relates back to regulation, and how it could enable regulation in the future that maybe you might want to answer, and then go to a wrap up with.
That's great, and thanks for the time flag, Elaine. And that's a very good segue, actually. So where does regulation come in? Well, it's not our job to tell society what it should regulate. So that's the job of Parliament, and we have structures for doing that through the upper and lower house. And then also the Law Commission is a revising body, so it looks at existing regulation and tries to iron out the wrinkles and get it redrafted if the experience of enacting that regulation leads to practical difficulties. So there are some checks and balances in the regulatory process. In the case of an emerging technology where it's not quite clear what the regulation should be, it is possible that regulation will come down the track in the future. And I mean, DCMS recently published a white paper on online digital harms, or online harms, and it is busy considering what regulatory space in the digital, what regulation should be drafted in the regulatory space. And so they're thinking about that. Now, I think we have an opportunity with this standard for companies who want to behave properly to accumulate their protocols for behaving properly and mitigating harm. And then if we can aggregate that at the national level so that everybody who's working in the machine learning space is approached to responsible innovation in this kind of way, this sort of regulation would allow them to move forward in a sensible way. This kind of regulation might be unhelpful and would create the sort of obstacles that Dave flagged at the beginning of this session in respect of, for example, introducing new seeds. Then we've got an opportunity to provide that information into the regulators. I mean, Innovate UK has an explicit mandate to be a voice to government on behalf of industry in respect of innovation. Now, that's not a lobbying voice, but it is an information sharing voice. We don't control, we don't direct, we don't do any of those sorts of things, and we don't lobby, but we can inform. And I'll make the point later on that says, if we know who is using this standard, how they are using it, i.e. what sectors, and where it's working, and if there are any lessons coming, then we might be able to get some information that would help make regulation that might come in the future more fit for purpose, and avoid bits of regulation that have been quite difficult, like the Dangerous Dogs Act, for example, enacted quickly, quite difficult to enforce. So I think that's a really interesting thing. I'll say how we might do that in a moment, but I think that's the kind of point. We're talking about future regulation. The question is, can we inform that by behaving intelligently and properly now, and then sharing what works with regulators for them to decide what to do with. Right, let me summarize, because I think we did start 5 minutes late, so we're overrun by a minute or two just to summarize. But first of all, thanks very much, Dave and Rory. Expertise that shone through, really helpful and informed debate. I would have loved another hour of it, but anyway, perhaps we can pick up on that offline another time. So just to conclude the launch of this PAS then, I should say, why is it called PAS 440? Because that number's not an accident. If you're a musician, you'll know that it's quite important to play in tune. And if you've ever been to a concert, you'll hear an orchestra tuning up beforehand. And the case of the orchestra is quite a good analogy. They all tune to a note which is A above middle C. And that's why you hear that one note played by the oboe and then everybody else copies it. And if not every single section in the orchestra is playing perfectly to that note A, then the concert sounds pretty terrible. And the frequency of that note is 440 hertz. And so the analogy between the tuning of an orchestra to 440 hertz and the different sections in an orchestra playing nicely together because of that agreed standard tuning pitch is applicable to a supply chain. So if all parts of a supply chain are in agreement about how they conduct themselves, about how the different things fit together, and about what the purpose of what they're doing is, then you'll get a better result. So we chose that number because it's a number associated with harmony and things working well together, which is what this PAS is intended to do. And if you go back to the 17th and 18th century, in Europe alone, there are sort of over 30 different pitching systems in use, and that was kind of where we have been with responsible innovation, with different approaches being done by different people in different sectors. So that's the reason for the name. The PAS recognizes that technology per se is neither good nor bad. It's what you do with it that matters. And therefore we need to have processes that cause us to achieve the benefits, but to avoid any potential harms. And that's what this PAS is intended to do. It gives a framework to companies for managing and communicating that balance. And you can download it for free. If you want a paper copy, you have to buy it from the BSI shop, but that's probably worth doing. And you can use it to improve your innovation success. So this is, obviously it's a good thing for society, but the reason that we at Innovate UK are driving it, as well as that, is it's actually good business. So we'd encourage people to do it. It stops them getting cold feet later in life, I think. And this is the ask on you. So we do encourage you to use it. We hope that you will. We hope that it'll improve your business. But if you're able to share your experience of it with us, then we can, one, reiterate the PAS, and if we do an update to it, it can be a better document because of user experience. So that's important. And secondly, if we know what sectors people are using it in and what control systems are effective, we can potentially gather that up, and we can offer that information to regulators in the future who can create regulation that works for the good guys and yet kind of keeps the cowboys at bay potentially. So, I mean, I'm not a regulator, and of course they may choose to ignore us, but we've got an opportunity to do that if we do that. So we've created an email address, which you can see on your screen. Please, at the point at which you download it, email us and say that you have, maybe tell us a bit about yourself. And if you can give us GDPR permissions to contact you, it's our intention in a certain period in the future, I don't know when, maybe in a year or something, to follow up with users and find out, is this working? Does it add value to UK innovation? And, should we be pointing this in the direction of an ISO standard, for example? I don't know. We just have to see. We're at the start of what I hope will be a really useful journey. But of course, it's just a bit of paper or some words on a sheet of paper, then it does no good at all. We're really hoping that it comes to life and informs the way that businesses operate. Okay, I think that's enough. I'll thank you all for attending. I thank my panel and BSI and Lemon Zest for the IT structure, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.